And I do conservation research with amphibians and reptiles in the region, but I also help direct the Calling Frog Survey, which focuses on this community science effort to monitor frog populations in the Chicago wilderness region. So we do span most of northern Illinois, northeastern Illinois, into southeast Wisconsin, northwest Indiana, and even into southwest Michigan. So we do have people from throughout the region here. So welcome to everyone. And if Andrea and then Barbara, and I think I also saw Sarah from Indiana here, if you would like to introduce yourselves as our regional coordinators.
Yeah, I can start. I'm Andrea. I am the coordinator of community science in Winnebago County. I work for Severson Dells Nature Center, and I'm really excited for this frog season.
So hello, I'm Barbara Sherwood. I'm the volunteer liaison for natural resources for the Forest Preserve District of Will County. So if you're looking to do a calling frog survey on Forest Preserve property in Will County, I am your contact. So reach out to me via email, and I'm sure Allison can make sure we get in contact.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Sarah Barnes. I'm the programs manager at Shirley Hines Land Trust, and I believe in 2016 I took over the coordinating duties. So we do a number of other citizen science opportunities at Shirley Hines. This is one of them.
Well, thank you all so much. And for those of you new to the program, we will be sharing the contact information for all of the regions. So you have the different volunteer and stewardship coordinators and the various point people to talk to for the different land management agencies where we do our monitoring. So just for some housekeeping, we're going to try to keep the questions in the chat window just because we do have a very large group and we want to keep it streamlined. So there's some material that if you've seen our program before, you know I might get to it in a few minutes. So if I don't answer your question right away, just be patient. We can have a break after the first section of this. There's a good stopping point and we can go through any questions I didn't get to. Then we'll take a little stretch break and then we'll move on to some more of the frog identification. So just for everybody's ease of hearing the various frog calls, if you could keep your microphones on mute to try to minimize the background noise, that would be great. And again, we are recording tonight's workshop so that we have it for a resource in case anybody gets disconnected or if we need it for any other reason. So if you're not comfortable with having your image on here, please make sure your camera is off. And we will try to make the link available via our website. So if you need a copy of the video right away, I can also email you a link in the next few days as well. So tonight we're going to be talking about how we conduct our calling frog surveys, a bit about natural history of the regional species, and we'll talk about how to identify them. And in this, we're going to discuss why it's important to monitor frogs and toads in the first place. We'll talk about the habitats that the species occupy, their different forms of vocal communication. We're listening for particular types of calls, but we're going to hear some additional calls while we're out. So we'll talk about how we distinguish those. And then we'll talk about how you can set up your survey route, how you actually go about conducting a frog survey, what the data sheet looks like, those types of logistics. Then we'll have our short break and get into the frog ID by call and site. The next part will focus on just where you go to enter your data. So we'll walk you through the online data form. And if you want to stick around for a call quiz, we do have a little interactive call quiz where you can try to ID the species that we just went through. So the goals of the program are to help establish frog survey routes throughout the Chicago wilderness region, And as I mentioned, this spans multiple states and many counties. And really the whole idea is that this Chicago Wilderness Organization spans municipal and agency boundaries so that we can all kind of collaborate on, common conservation efforts. And in this case, frog monitoring and better understanding our distribution of frog species and how their populations are responding to changes in habitat quality over time. So the more data we collect, the more robust our data set will become. And as we get long-term data sets for various sites, we can start identifying trends in local frog and toad population growth or decline. We can see how ranges have contracted or expanded through time, and we can help understand where they may still be persistent threats that need to be addressed in order to conserve our regional species. So frogs and toads are worth monitoring for many reasons. First of all, they're ridiculously adorable and wonderful, and I think we all know that. That's why we're here. But they also occupy a very important ecological role, and that is basically being right in the middle of the food chain. They are predators on insects, small invertebrates, variety of other things. In a lot of cases, frogs are basically like hopping mouths, and so they will eat whatever they can fit in their mouth successfully. So they can be very ambitious, but they're also prey species. So they're fed upon by wading birds, they're fed upon by snakes, mesocarnivores. And this is really important as well. In 2020, there was actually a study published by Karen Lips of University of Maryland, and she published this study on the collapse of amphibian communities in Central America. And she was one of the first people who really was at the forefront of describing the Central and South American frog decline catastrophe that really kind of hit national news in the mid-1990s. And because of this widespread decline, which was actually driven by a fungal pathogen, which we'll mention later, she's actually seen successive collapse now in the snake community because there were so many species of snakes that were feeding on frogs. And so this middle photo is a picture from one of her recent studies describing this kind of faunal cascade and this collapse because of loss of frogs from that middle section of the ecosystem. There were also other changes in these stream systems when tadpoles were lost, which included algal blooms and other things that affect the fish that live there. So we do see these really strong interconnections for frogs, and that's why we really need to keep an eye on what's happening with them, because their presence has ripple effects on other trophic levels. So in the 90s, there was increased attention worldwide, really, about the global amphibian decline phenomenon. And you may remember, especially in the upper Midwest in the mid-90s, there were a series of stories about amphibian malformation and frogs with multiple limb syndrome. Especially in Minnesota, I remember growing up and hearing about kids finding frogs in ponds with extra legs, things like that. That was actually a malformation that was caused by infection of a trematode, which always occurred in the environment. But what was happening was that there were so many pollutants and various environmental stressors that the frog's immune systems became so suppressed that they couldn't fight off infection after a time. And so we really started seeing more and more of this malformation. And this is something that we do see on occasion here in the Chicago region. By 1998, as I mentioned, Dr. Karen Lips had discovered and identified this frog chytrid fungus, Batrachochytrium dendrobatitis, which grows on the keratin of frog skin. So as larvae, they only have keratin on the mouth parts. That's when it starts attacking them. And as they go through metamorphosis, the skin becomes increasingly keratinized and the fungus spreads over their skin and can impede their respiration. And this is a waterborne fungus, and it's something that's also present in the region. There has been documentation using museum studies going back to specimens from 1899 that have found the presence of this fungus here in Illinois. So it's been around a while, but whether it actually causes widespread decline may depend on the strain, and it may depend on the immune suppression of different frog populations, as well as the variety of stressors that are in their environment. So these are the reasons why it's really critical to monitor. By 2006, it was declared that we had a global amphibian extinction crisis. Over 160 species of frogs had gone extinct in the course of 20 years, much of that driven by fungal pathogens, but there are other pathogens, and habitat loss is a driving factor behind all of these declines that we see. So it's important for us to monitor frogs and toads locally because we need to know what's happening in our own backyard. Here in the Midwest, our states have lost the greatest percentage of original wetlands. In Illinois, we've lost about 85% of our pre-European settlement wetlands. If you couple that with how much prairie we've lost, we've really made it very hard for a lot of species to persist over time and for their populations to function as they once did. So in the 1930s, a lot of wetlands that were in the region were either drained or they were replaced with artificial farm ponds. Now, some species can still use farm ponds, but often the ponds were then stocked with fish. And for most of our regional amphibian species, they can't breed in places where there are fish because fish eat their eggs and fish eat their tadpoles. So with the exception of species like bullfrogs and green frogs that do have the ability to coexist in some places with certain species of fish, we really took away a lot of these wetland habitats that were on the landscape. So we had, coupled with that increased intensive row crop agriculture and cattle grazing that further accelerated decline by adding non-point source pollution to some of the remaining wetlands from runoff from fertilizers, pesticides. And despite our best efforts to really try to restore the wetlands that we have and create new wetlands in our area, roads, urban sprawl, suburban sprawl, and agriculture, depending where you are in the region, still do represent an impediment to frogs' ability to colonize new habitats. So even if we try to rebuild what was there, we have to remember that these are small organisms with very specific constraints on their ability to move on the landscape. So because of that, it's important to understand where they are, how they're distributed, how those populations are doing, and where we can help. So the habitats that we're going to focus on in our surveys are going to include both flowing and standing water habitats. Oops, I'm going to make that orange square go away. Sorry about that. Here we go. So yeah, we have flowing water habitats like streams and rivers and creeks that certain species will breed in. We have standing water like ponds, lakes, marshes and swamps, and even roadside ditches on occasion that can be breeding sites for certain species. And each frog species is going to have its own unique requirements. So some species really prefer temporary pools like vernal pools or ephemeral pools. And these are wetlands that will fill up in spring as the snows melt and as it starts to become rainier. And those ponds are usually going to dry sometime in May or June. And that keeps the ponds from being occupied by predatory fish. So these frogs focus on those ephemeral wetlands. They're considered vernal pool obligate species. So they won't breed in permanent water where fish are present. So when we're talking about frogs, they are one of many amphibians in the world. And so the term amphibious is referring to the two-phase life cycle where they're spending part of the time on land and part of the time in the water. And how much time they spend in each habitat type is going to vary depending on the identity of the species. But because they make use of both habitats, that makes them really good indicators of the health of both upland and wetland habitats. So adults will migrate in spring to these breeding ponds in order to mate, and they're going to lay their eggs in the water. And our regional frogs all have external fertilization. There are a few species in Central America where internal fertilization has been documented, but here in the region, they lay eggs out in the water. Fertilization is external. Those eggs will hatch in the water. They'll hatch into tadpoles, and then they're going to be actively grazing on algae and periphyton and biofilm, which is a combination of fungus as well as periphyton. So they're feeding on that. They're grazing on the surfaces of submerged branches and vegetation and logs to feed on this material. So then as the ponds start to dry down, they get hormonal cues, usually spiked by increased production of stress hormone that's actually going to cue production of their little limb buds. So they're going to get their back legs first, then they're going to develop their front legs, and then they're going to make their way onto land. So some species can be aquatic, fully aquatic. Some species can be semi-aquatic, where they spend a lot of time in the water, but they can move on land. And other species are highly terrestrial, but all of them rely on the presence of water in order to lay their eggs. And the juveniles, as I mentioned, are primarily herbivorous. They're grazing, but the adults are carnivorous. So they will eat fish, they will eat other frogs, they will try to occasionally eat birds. It depends on the size of the frog that you're looking at. But most of them are feeding on a variety of soil arthropods in the surrounding forest or surrounding prairie. And frogs are primarily nocturnal, so they can be seen and heard during the day if it's very overcast and if it's rainy, but our best chance to observe them and monitor them is by doing evening surveys. This is in part because frogs have permeable skin. So that permeable skin, they respire through it, and that makes them prone to desiccating. They can dry out if it's low humidity day, if it's very hot out. They can dry out also if they're trying to move across a landscape where they don't have moist cover that they would normally get from moving through leaf litter. And that's why road fragmentation makes it really difficult for them, because they don't have that cover that they need to prevent them from desiccating. And so that's why we see a lot of these movements across roads on rainy spring nights. So to reduce water loss, they are limiting most of their activity to nighttime when the relative humidity is going to be greater and temperatures are going to be cooler. And they do have this advantage of the skin acting as a respiratory surface so that they can stay in the water for long periods of time. And they're taking up oxygen, dissolved oxygen from the water through capillaries in the skin. So we're gonna see some, well, hear some different forms of vocal communication from our regional frogs. And the main types of communication that we're paying attention to when we're doing our surveys are advertisement calls. These are the calls that the male is making to try to attract a female in order to mate. You will on occasion hear an aggressive call or several aggressive calls, and this is where one male gets too close to the territory of another male, and they'll try to chase each other off. Sometimes they'll actually wrestle and physically try to move each other either out of each other's territory, or if one male is actually about to mate with a female, they might try to wrestle each other away from her. And so when that happens, you hear another call called a release call. And then you'll hear courtship calls, which are modifications of that main advertisement call. And it's a very subtle difference, and I don't expect you to mark down, oh, this is a courtship call versus an advertisement call. But if you hear a slight variation on what you're expecting to hear, it may be because the male senses that a female is approaching. And occasionally, we will hear some distress calls when a frog is seized by a predator. One of the reasons that, oh, that was my cat, if you heard that call. One of the reasons that we hear a lot of these aggressive calls, especially with species like leopard frogs and bullfrogs, are because these species tend to have what we call satellite males. So calling is very energetically expensive activity, and it's usually the larger males that have a greater energetic reserve. So they can sit in this spot in the pond and call very loudly and call for a long period of time, and they can call at a greater rate of speed than some of the other males can. And so there's a lot of selection on males from the females based on the call quality. And so sometimes you'll have diminutive males that don't have the energetic reserve to continue calling, and they will sit off to the side of this larger male and try to intercept females as they're coming in to mate. And those are the satellite males. So when a calling male becomes aware of that, that's when you really start to hear these kind of strange chuck and grunt sounds, and we'll play some of those so you're familiar with what those are. Each frog and toad has a unique species-specific breeding call, and that's really helpful for us because that means we can use the calls to determine which species are present in a site. We say that individual frogs call, but when we have a full group, a large group, we call that chorus. And so frogs are going to chorus best at night. So we're going to conduct our surveys about half an hour after sunset so that we have the best chance of detecting those calls. And that means that you might not actually see the frogs that you're hearing, but we will teach you to identify them by sight as well as sound, because sometimes you'll get to a pond and maybe it's a little bit early in the breeding window and you might see some frogs sitting there, but they're not making sounds. You can still write down that you observed them, but that they weren't heard calling. So that might tell us that either the breeding peak hasn't happened yet or that it already happened and we're at the tail end of it. And we can learn more about seasonal activity patterns the more data like that we are able to collect. So our program, the Calling Frog Survey, originally started back in 2000 by Chicago Wilderness, and it moved over to Peggy Bart Nature Museum and Chicago Academy of Sciences in 2014. And the survey was originally initiated because of the loss of this little species here, the cricket frog, from the northern third of the state. In the 1960s, the cricket frog was really one of the most common species that you would find in this part of the state. But they went through this very rapid decline, and we'll talk a little bit more about why when we get up to that species later. But really, in order to prevent other species from having that same kind of large-scale rapid decline, this is one of the reasons it's important to monitor. By having community scientists out in as many sites as possible, we're gathering more data more efficiently through participation of a network of volunteers. So we can cover more ground simultaneously, seeing what's happening in different sites. And, you know, as a researcher, I can only work in a handful of sites at one time. So the most I typically can get to for frogs in a season to intensively study a population is like 6 sites. But we typically have at least 100 people out monitoring frogs in this program. And so we're much more able to see what's happening with different species, see how ranges contract, ranges expand, and where we need to focus our conservation efforts. So in terms of what's required of volunteers, we ask that you attend our workshop, which you're doing tonight, and we'll go through the breeding calls of the local species, again, how to identify them primarily by sound, but also by sight. And we'll talk about their natural history in terms of when they breed, what type of water they might be found in, permanent, temporary ponds, semi-permanent ponds, woodlands, prairies. And so you'll learn more about which habitats different species are associated with. So when you go out to a site, you have a better idea of what species you might expect to find. And we'll talk about how we actually do the survey itself and go through some personal safety and monitoring etiquette. So we do ask you to conduct at least 3 surveys in evenings between March and early July. And each of these surveys is supposed to be conducted in a specific frame of dates, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Now, you are certainly welcome to do more than that. 3 is the minimum that we ask. If you think you want to try to do more than that, I highly recommend doing multiple surveys in the first round of sampling. And that's because if you've lived here long enough, you know how we get these temperature swings and weather swings in March and April. So it could be sunny one day, it could be snowing the next. And so that's going to affect the activity of different species. And so emergence and the start of breeding activity may be delayed. So if you go out a little bit more frequently in that first round, you're more likely to detect more species. So when you go out, you'll listen and try to identify all the calls that you'll hear. You're going to assign them a call index, which is a metric of call intensity, which we'll go through. And then you'll write that down in your data sheet and then enter your observations into our database. So these are the 3 sampling windows. The first is early spring, and in some years that can start as early as February 25th. It's not looking like it when I look out my window and see however much snow that is. But that window is actually the longest of the 3 windows. It extends out to April 20th. And what's really nice about Frog Survey is that, we have 13 species in the Chicago wilderness region, and you can break them up into subsets of which species you might hear calling in each of these rounds. So you don't have to immediately learn all 13 for the first round of sampling. You should maybe try to learn 4 or 5 of those species, and then another 4 or 5 species for the next round, and then probably 3 for the last round, depending on where your sampling location is. So in that early spring round, the species that we might hear are going to be the chorus frog, the spring peeper, the wood frog, the northern leopard frog, and if you're very lucky, the pickerel frog. Pickerel frogs are very rare in the region, so we really are only aware of one site in our network that has detected them recently. The mid-spring round goes from May 10th to May 30th, and the species that call then include the American toad, Fowler's toad, eastern gray tree frog, and Cope's gray tree frog. And typically, depending on where you are in the region, you will have one of these 2 tree frogs. You don't tend to have both of them occurring at the same site. So that will narrow down your list a little bit more. And then the late spring, early summer round goes from June 20th to July 10th. And these are our late breeding species. So this is going to be the cricket frog, green frog, and bullfrog. And just so you know, all of this information is present on our website, which is frogsurvey.org. So if you miss a piece of information, it's on there. You can refer to it later. You can always email me and ask me. My email address is also on our website, frogsurvey.org. And we have an MP3 audio library so that you can download the different frog calls. If you want to listen to them, you can just play them off your computer. You could play them on your phone or in your car. And so before you do the survey, make sure that you're familiar with which species you might expect to hear and what their calls sound like. You can always bring a recording device with you so that if you're not sure about something, you can play it back, or you can send me the recording if you're having trouble determining which of a subset of similar species it might be. But one of the best ways to learn what these calls sound like is to make up your own verbal description of what the call sounds like to you. Practice, mimic the calls, impress your friends with your great frog impressions. And I do want to point you toward a resource, which is Cornell University's Macaulay Library of Wildlife Sounds. This is linked on our website as well. And the Macaulay Library does not just have frog calls, it has as many wildlife species as you can think of, birds, mammals, what have you. What's really cool about their site is, in addition to listening to the audio, you actually see a spectrogram, so a visual output of what the call looks like. So you can see how the call shapes differ among species. You could see that the frequencies are going to be high for some species, low for other species, or that it's kind of staying at one level note versus kind of escalating trills. And I find as a more visual learner that seeing the shape of the calls really helps discern which species you're listening to if you're confused about a couple of similar ones. So I highly recommend that site. So the next thing you're going to do is establish a monitoring route. And if you don't have a monitoring route already, we will help you with that process. So if you're a returning monitor, please continue working on the same site. One of the reasons we ask that is so that we have long-term continuity in data, because if people switch sites every year, you don't get that nice long data set. So it's really hard to say, oh, species are doing better or worse here, or populations increasing or decreasing. We need multiple years in order to capture what might be annual environmental variation. It's a cold year, it's a hot year, a drought year, what have you. That's why we need those long-term data sets to really be able to say what is going on with these various species. So if you do have time, you can try to add additional routes, but please be mindful that in certain areas where we have just higher population density, in certain parts of the region, the number of sites right in that core area may be limited. So you might not necessarily be able to monitor your favorite site. But we will also try to help you find a monitoring partner if that's something you're interested in. Often new monitors like to go out with a more experienced monitor so that they kind of get the hang of it. And if you're not sure if you're ready to take on your own route, that's certainly something that we can try to help facilitate. So for those of you who are new, after the workshop, we'll help you find a route that will work for you, and we might suggest some sites that are high priority because of scientific reasons or for land management reasons. For example, if they've been recently restored, we want to collect baseline data to see which species come back over time, things like that. So the survey routes should ideally be located on public lands or publicly accessible sites when possible. So we try to keep them on forest preserve, nature preserve, or park district property. And that's because these are places where the landscape is being actively restored. And it's also places that people can continue to monitor years into the future. So I know a lot of people, if they have land, are interested in monitoring on their own land. We're not going to say, no, you can't do that. But in terms of having people kind of continue to monitor those sites into the future, if you relocate, then we're not going to be able to continue having somebody at that point in space monitoring. So that's why we really do emphasize trying to better understand how our local species are responding to the various restoration efforts that the land management agencies are doing and stewards are doing. So for your survey route, we ask you to try to establish at least 5 listening points or locations where you're going to stand and listen for calls along the path that you'll walk, which is your route. Some sites are not large enough for 5, so we'll adjust as best we can. I know we do have one small site I can think of that has 2 monitoring points in it on the route. And that's because these listening points need to be spaced about 200 meters apart. And that's so we have spatial independence. So we know we're hearing calls from frogs associated with a very particular wetland or a particular part of a wetland, rather than hearing frogs calling from multiple locations. That just muddles it and makes it more challenging to collect data associated with particular wetland environments. So, and even when you're, when you're at your listening point, you may hear some distant frogs. Really try to focus as best you can on what is calling in your immediate vicinity. So just for our terminology, we call the route the overall site or area where you're conducting your survey, and the location is the listening point where you're standing and recording what frogs you're hearing along your survey route. In order to increase the diversity of frogs that you might detect, we really recommend that you try to sample a route with several different habitat types. So it might have a temporary forested pond, and then it may have a semi-permanent pond or a lake, or it may have a marsh or a little creek going through it. The more diverse the wetland habitats are, generally you're going to find greater diversity in frog species that are using those areas. So after the workshop, if you do decide that you want to monitor, please send me an email to confirm, yes, you want to participate. If you can, please prepare a short list of monitoring sites that are convenient for you. So you know what's best for your particular commute and what's close to you better than I do. So if you come to me with a short list, that's going to help expedite the process of getting you a good monitoring site. Then you'll also get in touch with your regional landowner or county coordinator, and I'll put their information up, and it's also on our website on frogsurvey.org. And we also ask you to please complete a volunteer application for the Calling Frog Survey so that we can be in touch with reminders when each sampling round is starting and ending, so you remember, oh, I should go out and monitor, I only have a week left, things like that, or when it's time to enter data. The link is a little hard to find. It's on our website, but it's at the very bottom of the homepage. It says apply to the program here. If you click on the word here, it will bring you to the application form, and you can put your short list of sites there, or you can email that to me as well. So the next thing that we need to do when we're establishing our route is record GPS coordinates for each of those listening points where you're standing and monitoring frogs. You can use that, use a GPS unit or a smartphone to do that. In some of the counties, I know that some of the volunteer offices and stewardship offices have some GPS units that you can sign out if you don't have a way to record coordinates. You can always contact either myself or the coordinating agency, and they may be able to have someone come help you if I'm unavailable to do that. But you can also use Google Earth and drop a pin on your phone and send that to me. That's another way you could do it. We record our coordinates in a decimal degree format using this format seen here on the slide. So for latitude in northeastern Illinois, it might be 44.444 something. And then our longitude is going to be negative number. It's going to be negative 88 or 87, generally with 4 digits after it. So please remember when you're recording it that the longitude is going to be negative number. So when you're conducting the survey, you actually need to wait for suitable weather conditions to arrive, and you want to time your arrival at the first listening point so that you can start monitoring about half an hour after sunset. And we're trying to do that so that everybody is sampling at the same time under relatively similar conditions so that everything is standardized. Someone's not out there in the middle of the day versus in the middle of the night. The frogs are fresh, they've rested all day, they're first getting ready to call, and they're more energetic, and that's why we pick that time window to do that. Yes, you can hear some frogs early in the morning, but you may not hear all the species of frogs if you go out very early. And it's also important to remember, because we're assigning them an index of call intensity, that if they've been calling all night, these are guys who are still maybe trying to find a mate, and they're tired by then. So you're not going to get the same intensity of calling that you would if you had gone early in the evening when they had more of an energetic reserve. So that's why we kind of try to synchronize it that way. So our guidelines for suitable weather change a little bit with each of the sampling rounds. So for the first round, that February 25th to April 20th round, we're waiting for the air temperature to be a minimum of 45 degrees. So we're not saying, oh, it's February 25th, time to monitor. We're saying, is it 45 degrees? And that's evening temperature, air temperature, for them to be calling. For the second round, the May 10th to May 30th round, we're waiting for it to be 55 degrees. And for the June to July round, we're waiting for it to be 65 degrees. So temperature is a very important constraint to pay attention to. But we also do record some other weather data. So we're going to record wind strength using what we call the Beaufort wind scale, and I'll walk you through that. We're going to record air temperature, and you can use your phone or check the weather forecast for your area. And we're going to estimate cloud cover, rounding to about 10%. So you're going to kind of look up at the horizon, or overhead, and try to imagine how much of the sky that you can see around you in your field of view is covered by cloud. So 50%, 10%, you don't have to be very precise. It's kind of subjective, but we want to know basically, is it only a little bit cloudy? Is it completely cloudy? Because that's going to influence how much light there is. It's also going to influence whether certain celestial cues are present for amphibians, and it's going to influence some sky glow as well, which relates to light pollution, especially in the Chicago region. So we'll also record a Weather Bureau sky code that's also related to cloud cover, but also precipitation. And there's 2 check boxes on the data sheet that you'll have to fill out to say whether or not it was above or below freezing in the preceding 48 hours, and whether there was precipitation in the preceding 48 hours. So this is all on your data sheet, and we'll walk you through the data sheet as well, so you don't have to memorize this, just to kind of give you a sense of the type of information we're asking for. This is the Beaufort wind scale. It goes from 0 to 5, and you're basically assigning a scale or a code to different sets of wind speeds. And so if it's 1 to 3 mile an hour winds, that's going to be a wind scale 1. If it's 8 to 12 mile an hour winds, that's going to be a wind scale 3. There is a description there. If you don't know exactly what the wind speed is, you could kind of look to see if the leaves are moving, or if branches of trees are moving, or if the whole tree is really vigorously swaying, as another way to kind of assess this. A couple of things I want to point out, though, is that at wind scale 4 and wind scale 5, so basically wind speeds greater than 12 miles an hour, it's too windy to be monitoring. Sometimes when you're out, it may start off calm and the wind might kick up. If that happens, you record that on your data sheet, that it changed and which sampling location that you were at. However, our ability to detect frog calls is going to decrease the windier it is, and the likelihood that a frog is going to continue to call is going to decrease if it gets really windy. So just to show you what that's based on, there are a lot of studies on how our ability to detect various species using different methods may change under different conditions. And so this was a study by Smith et al. From 2014, focused on northern leopard frogs. And this is a fairly common species in our region, but it's actually one that's pretty hard to hear, and it's often misidentified. And so as an example, I'm sure most of you have seen northern leopard frogs, and you can confirm that when you see the photos in a little bit. But in 2018, we had, I think, 110 survey routes covered, and leopard frogs were only reported by call from 17% of those routes. So we know that they're a species that people tend to miss. And so if you look here, this study was looking at ability of observers to detect them by call. And you can see that as the wind chill increases, our ability to hear them also increases. But as wind speed increases, our ability to detect them decreases. And so if you put those factors together, you get this kind of cloud of detection points. So low wind speed and high wind chill are going to give us that best opportunity to detect them. And so that's what these suitable weather condition recommendations are based on. Studies like this that are really taking into account the different factors that affect the calling activity of the species, as well as the human ear and our capability. So we have our Weather Bureau sky code. So it's basically focused on whether it's cloudy, foggy, drizzling, snowing, showers, rain, and you'll record that. And again, the Weather Bureau information and the wind speed codes are all on the back of the data sheet for your reference. So when you get out to your listening points, you're going to stand at each location for 5 minutes, and you're going to try to identify which species are calling, and then you're going to record a call index. So that's the call intensity or activity level for each species that you hear. And you might need to wait a few minutes to let the frogs acclimate to the fact that you're there. So I'm sure most of us have experienced hearing frogs really loudly at a pond just up the trail, and we start, walking over to see who's there, and then it goes dead silent. When that happens, the frogs think that we're an approaching predator, and one of the reasons they're calling at night is to avoid being picked off by visual predators. So they're hunkering down and waiting till we leave. So we have to wait about 5 minutes in order to let them just kind of acclimate and realize, okay, this is a person, they're not trying to catch me right now. So if other noise or other sources of light or something like that seems to disrupt them, you can extend your listening window an extra 5 minutes. So especially if you're doing any roadside monitoring, I know some people do have routes that go along roads to different wetlands, and some people have ponds that are very close to edges of preserves. Those tend to be noisy. In some cases, the frogs become acclimated to it, but generally they are going to respond to the vibration of our footfalls, basically walking up to the pond, and that's going to get them to be fairly quiet. I will also ask that because light does curtail calling activity, that you not try to spotlight them. Don't shine a flashlight directly in their face or trying to see them. I know we want to see them, but that does disrupt their breeding activity and it makes them more visible to predators. So really try to keep a low profile when you're at the wetland, and try to disturb them as little as possible while we're collecting this breeding data. So for our call indices, we have a couple of different definitions. So we're basically trying to listen for space between calls. So index 1 is going to be individual calls that can be counted. We don't expect you to try to count them, but what we're listening for is space between the calls. So I'm going to do a spring peeper impression of a spring peeper calling it index 1, and it's going to sound like this. So there's space between those calls. And Andrea, would you like to be in index 2 spring peeper with me?
I can try my very best.
Okay, you can get started. I'll be the second
beep,
frog.
Beep, 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 beep.
Very good. So you see that we have that overlap. You can still tell there are two of us or two frogs calling, but there's overlap. We don't have that distinct gap, that distinct space. And we'll play recordings so you hear the actual frogs, but I think we did a pretty mean spring peeper impersonation. And the third call index is the full chorus. And so for spring peepers, this would sound like sleigh bells because their calls are so high frequency and so intense, it almost hurts your ears. But it's this continuous overlapping sound that really becomes impossible for you to distinguish individuals anymore. And so that's really what we're listening for, and we'll practice that a little bit. I see there's some questions popping up. I'm just going to finish this section, and then I can take some questions and people can take a stretch break. So I just want to let you know that we do have some species that are difficult to identify. And for those species, we try to ask you to record their calls on your phone or with a digital recorder if you have one with you. And for those species, if you can't get a recording, if you can get a picture, even if it's kind of a low quality phone picture, I can kind of discuss with you the features as we go through the frogs that are going to distinguish one from the other. So where there are similar species, we want to have digital vouchers, especially in the case of rare species, to support these observations. So certain species like Cope's gray tree frog and eastern gray tree frog are morphologically identical. They're distinguished because one is tetraploid and one is diploid, but their calls are distinct. So because the calls are distinct, we can listen and figure out which one is which. And there's also some difference in terms of which watersheds they're associated with. But the eastern gray tree frog has a slower call. The Cope's gray tree frog has a faster call rate. And so when it's warm, the eastern call starts speeding up and starts to sound a little bit like a slow Cope's gray tree frog. So for that reason, we need that air temperature because that's going to affect that call rate. And having the recording is really useful. The rare frogs in the region are the wood frogs, Fowler's toads, cricket frogs, pickerel frogs, and plains leopard frogs. And these are written in bold on your data sheet. So if you think you're hearing one, please do try to record it. It's in bold there so that we can help document that this rare species actually was in the site. So this is what the data sheets look like, and you can download them from our website, frogsurvey.org. And so at the top, you're going to put your route name, the monitor name, so your name, and if you have a monitoring partner, you're going to check off the boxes to indicate if this is the first, second, or third sampling round. You'll put the date and the check boxes for precipitation and whether it's below freezing. And you'll give each of your listening points a name, or you can keep it as a number, but a lot of people like descriptive names. And you're going to record those weather conditions. So you'll have your start time and your end time. If things really shift weather-wise, so much that the temperature drops and you think it's affecting calling activity, please record that and record the corresponding location where that happens. The same with cloud cover or wind speed. So then lower down, we have our call data. So we have the 13 species in the region listed in this first column, and then we have space for up to 8 listening points. Most people do not have 8 listening points, but we have a handful of routes that do. So if you have less, those extra columns will just be blank. And so in these columns, for each species, you'll write a 1, 2, or 3 if you hear them for the call index. So whether it's individuals that can be distinguished, whether there's some overlap, or whether it's a full continuous chorus. And if you don't hear a species, you can leave that completely blank, indicating that you surveyed for it, but that it wasn't heard in the site. And then if you see it, you can write OB for observed and that it wasn't heard calling. So all of that is down at the bottom of the data sheet, those call index definitions. The sky code and wind codes and wind speeds are on the back of the data sheet. And then we have space for notes on the various locations. So if the water level has changed, if a site is flooded and you can't get over to a particular point, you could write that down here. If it's looking like it's going to be a drought year and all your ponds dry up, you're not going to find frogs then. So you would record that as well. And if you see any other interesting wildlife, you're welcome to record that. We can share those data with the various forest preserve districts. On the back, this is where you can record your coordinates and your route description. So you'll kind of write a description of the types of habitats that your listening points are located at. So whether it's a marsh or a river, or floodplain, or a temporary pond, and you'll write that latitude and longitude data in decimal degrees there. And you will only have to submit that once into our database unless your coordinates change for various reasons. So we ask you to enter your data by August 31st, and you'll enter it using an online form on frogsurvey.org. And alternatively, you can email it or scan it. Normally, I would say you could mail it in. Right now, we're working remotely while the Nature Museum is still closed to the public. So if you mail me something, I'm not sure when I will be in to get it. So it's best if you can enter it online, but otherwise I can help you enter it in other ways if it's too burdensome. So again, just a reminder to make sure you have the GPS coordinates so that later on we don't have this data that isn't associated with particular points in space. We really need that spatial data to go with the frog data as well. So we'll just talk about some supplies that are useful for bringing with you when you monitor. Certainly your data sheet, you might want a clipboard to lean on, possibly a Ziploc bag in case it starts raining, pens or pencils, a headlamp so that you could see where you're going, or a flashlight is fine. If you're bringing your phone as a recorder or as your source of light, you may want like a power bank so that your battery doesn't die, especially early in the season when it's cold. Our phone batteries tend to go pretty quickly. It's generally advisable to have some rubber boots, knee boots. They don't have to wear full waders, but like knee boots or rain boots are usually fine, especially as the snow is melting and sections of trails are flooded or very muddy. It's really useful, and we'll ask you to designate a pair of boots, if possible, to use in your site, or if you can't keep them just for that site, then to try to clean off the boots or soles of your shoes really thoroughly before and after monitoring. And this is to prevent spread of the chytrid pathogen, which is present in the region, as well as the ranavirus pathogen, which is also present episodically in Illinois. And we do have a cleaning protocol if you want to disinfect your boots. It's on our website under monitor resources. With both of these pathogens, ranavirus and chytrid, they're waterborne, fungus and virus, and they can live in mud. They can't hurt us, but they can harm a lot of other aquatic organisms, other species of frogs. Ranavirus can be also transmitted to turtles and fish. So we don't want to be spreading disease around. So we're trying to be as responsible as possible and make sure we get that gunk off the bottom of our boots. And you could also let it dry and scrape it. But really get rid of that mud if you're going to go wear those boots in another site. Just in terms of safety, we ask you to please check with the landowner whose site you're monitoring on regarding who to notify prior to monitoring. So it's usually either Forest Preserve law enforcement, or you might let local law enforcement know if your car is going to be parked like alongside an access. Just say, hey, I'm a volunteer with the park district and I'm going to be out here. Oftentimes the agencies will have a vehicle placard to put in your window saying, you're permitted to be there, you're a frog monitor. Some of them will give you an ID badge or a gate key so that you can park in the preserve. Again, basic safety things, water, snacks, stuff like that. During mosquito season, when it becomes somewhat unpleasant to be right next to a mosquito breeding site, this is something to be aware of. It's a good idea to wear rain jacket to minimize your bites, and a head net. We ask you to try to avoid DEET-based insect repellent because it is toxic to aquatic organisms, especially to frogs. Lemon eucalyptus spray works well for that. And really, if you keep the rain jacket and head net on, I'm in amphibian breeding sites for a good chunk of the year, and that's what I do. I do gloves, raincoat, and head net. And I actually don't usually wear any bug spray when I'm in those sites, but I know everybody's tolerance is different for that. So if you can, use like a natural repellent. For COVID safety, please check with the landowner regarding what their particular protocol is. In most cases, you will be asked to at least have a face mask on you in case you trip and fall and need help, or in case law enforcement does come up to see what you're doing so that you're keeping everybody safe. And especially if you're working with a partner from outside your household, please do continue to wear a face mask, especially early in the year when the humidity is low. hand sanitizer and gloves, that requirement may vary by landowner, and do please check that the site is open. So I know last year many of us had a lot of disruption to our monitoring routes because with the onset of the pandemic, everything was shutting down. And so some sites stayed open, some sites did not. And that can change based on what the case numbers are looking like. So do check that it's okay to be there so that you don't get all the way out there and then have to turn around and go home. So these are the contacts for the landowners here. I will let you take a break, but I'm going to start looking through the questions and see if I can field any of these questions. So why don't we meet back at 7:35? Trying to open the chat. Okay, so we have a question about if there's an app for from Cornell. At present, I'm not aware of a frog call app from Cornell. Their bird app is great, but with the frog apps, because the call frequencies really vary species to species, it's often hard to detect some of them. So I wouldn't really rely on that as a mode of ID because most of these apps do miss some of the low frequency calls. Coworker wants to do additional runs on your route. We can talk about that. You can do it. We like to have consistency in terms of who the observer is, but if you typically monitor together so that you're kind of in agreement, usually when we have pairs, people will be in agreement on what the species is and what the index is, and then one person will submit the data. But Karen, we can discuss that offline if you want about that, because usually we could partition sections of a route if it's something like that, if it's a longer route, but more runs don't hurt. We just like to have observer consistency as best we can. In terms of a page with everything that you need to monitor, really it's the main data sheet. So that will say it's too windy to monitor. In terms of temperature, if you just remember that it goes up by 10 degrees, so 45, 55, 65 as the minimum for each run, that's a good way to remember. The call index is at the bottom of the data sheet. The wind scale is all on there. When we did in-person workshops, I used to give out a little laminated wallet size card called the calling card that had the index and which species were breeding when. I don't have a way to distribute those to everybody, but it was basically a miniaturized version of a chart I'm going to show in the next section. Yes, totally acceptable to use your phone for wind and air temperature. Okay, so there is a question about how would you work with a partner now. Typically, we try to keep partners as people who are in the same households. In some cases, if there are people who want to work together who are not in the same household, as long as you stay socially distanced as you're hiking, which takes a little bit of practice, but I did that throughout field season with my technicians this year. We did wear masks in the field and made sure that we were standing at least 6 feet apart. And keep your own data sheet, keep your own pencil, things like that to minimize contact. Generally, outdoors is safer than indoors, but there is no risk situation. So you're not required to work with a partner if you're uncomfortable with it. But if you really feel like you want to, just do it safely, be mindful of distancing and masks and common points of contact, have your hand sanitizer with you, stuff like that. Any other questions? Yes, it is okay to work in a group of 3. We have, I think, 1 group of 4, and we have a long time group of 3 that's been monitoring, and they often invite other people in non-pandemic years out to their site, and everybody kind of goes and listens. They're really welcoming to new monitors, so it's a nice way to get into that. Absolutely. In terms of monitoring places near you, probably it just depends on the site. So I would need to have more information on a particular site. Like if it's a park district site, then we need permission from the park district if it closes before sunset. Most of the Chicago Park District locations are open till 11 p.m., but it varies by location. If it's a forest preserve, you often need a gate key, things like that. Mosquito discs. So it doesn't typically have a direct survival effect on frogs themselves. It's usually a larvicide that affects invertebrates. However, it does minimize the prey base for amphibians. Usually, though, kind of depending on the year, I know we've had some really high West Nile virus years in the past, and I think that the mosquito discs are usually a little bit more preferable to widespread fogging, where they're spraying adulticide in terms of toxicity, and just focusing on sites that have had positive tests for West Nile. That's usually how most of the forest preserves treat ponds. It's typically with very targeted activity toward positive Culex pipiens if they're carrying West Nile virus. But generally, fogging can be arranged by different municipalities, things like that. And if somebody's doing that on their own land, we don't really have control over it. But yeah, I mean, the frogs will eat the mosquito larvae, but as tadpoles, they're grazing. So if there's no adult frogs present, it's not necessarily going to impact them. All right, I'm going to get back to it. Let me just minimize the chat window. Okay, so now for what I think the fun part is. This is the frogs and their calls. And so we're going to go through the 13 species in the region, and we're going to go through them in phenological order. So this is the order that they tend to emerge throughout the year. And there can be variation from year to year, and we'll talk a little bit about that. This chart is on the website under Monitor Resources. It says Amphibian Phenology or Calling Phenology. So you can print this out. This is what I used to have, a little wallet card for monitors that I would give out. And so this is a nice cheat sheet, essentially, because it tells you which species to focus on for each sampling round. So round 1, the species that you might hear are going to be the ones whose core bars of call activity are in this blue area in this first set of columns. So that's going to be our wood frogs, chorus frogs, spring peepers, northern leopard frogs. And then in late May, you may start picking up a few other species, but their peak calling activity is going to probably be in May. And so that's going to be our American toad, pickerel frog, plains leopard, and then the gray tree frogs. And then some years you may hear green frogs start in May. It it depends on how warm it is, or cricket frogs as well, but those are species that have longer breeding windows, so they'll continue calling into round 3. So you might get them again in round 3, the green frog, the cricket frog, the Fowler's toad, and the bullfrog. And you'll notice that not all of the species have the same length call activity bar. So this is reflecting basically the length of the breeding season, but also the possibility that a species might continue calling. So for one species in particular, the wood frog, they're explosive breeders. So this means that they only call for typically a few nights or up to a week. So they're not going to call for that entire window from late February into early April. They might call for 2 nights, somewhere in that time spread. So that's why it's important to pay attention early on. And this is why I do recommend going out multiple times in that first round. If you're in a site that might have wood frogs, and that's going to depend on your habitat type, as well as your geographic location. Your window to detect them is going to be a little bit limited, but then you have species like chorus frogs, which tend to start early or sometimes before the wood frogs, and then they'll keep calling and they'll keep calling, and you'll keep hearing them basically throughout the first calling round, sometimes into the second calling round, and then sometimes on warm rainy days in September, you might start hearing some calls again. Northern leopard frog is also one that has a fairly long breeding window, but they're one of these subtle calling species. So, and I'll talk about why that is. It's a harder call to hear. One thing you'll also notice is how staggered things are in that first round. So spring peepers tend to be kind of like clockwork, where you wait for the chorus frogs, and then 2 weeks later, you will hear the spring peepers. If you're in a site that has one, you don't usually hear them call overlapping right at the start of the calling window, unless it's a very late spring. When we get very late springs, then you do get kind of wood frog, chorus frog, spring peeper, and northern leopard frog all calling really intensely. And I can tell you 2019, yeah, that was a polar vortex year. And we had a very delayed spring. We had 2 snowstorms in April, and that was one where all of these species were calling within the same week. And so you got to pay attention to what the conditions are like to meter what you might expect to hear. And to help you with that, I do want to point you to another resource. This is the Phenology project by Midwest Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, and this is a project I've been involved with for some time. So this is in collaboration with Herp Mapper, which is a herp atlasing program that's also a community science initiative. And so you can contribute real-time county level observation. So if you see a leopard frog or you hear a leopard frog, let's say, you can go and report that you saw it, and it'll ask you where you were, and it'll show up as like a green dot for the county. It'll color that county green on a map of where observations of that species have been. And I'll show you a screenshot of it later, but it's really nice because we can use that to try to inform when we go out monitoring. So if you're in a northern county, you can look at the county south of you and see whether or not people are observing certain species or not. And that might tell you if it's too early, or, oh no, it's a really good time to go out and sample. But it is a crowd, essentially crowdsourced resource. So people have to input data in order to get data out of it, essentially, because if nobody reports anything, it's not going to show anything. So the more you add your observations to it, and this could also just be your daytime observations of seeing a frog, that at least tells us, hey, this species is active and it might be calling soon. So it is really useful. So our first species is going to be the wood frog, and there's been some taxonomic revision for the regional North American frogs, largely since 2004. They were switched from genus Rana into genus Lithobates, and there's still very intense debate over whether taxonomists agree with that or not. So if you have like the 4th edition of Peterson's Field Guide to Eastern and Midwestern amphibians, it's going to say Lithobates. If you have the 3rd edition, it's going to say Rana. It's just going to depend on what resource you're looking at. It's the same species. So for our purposes, we'll just go with wood frog. And this is one of the 2 early species. So wood frogs and chorus frogs are the 2 that you may first detect. They are only about 2 inches in length. So they're in the pond frog family along with bullfrogs and green frogs, but they're much smaller. They have this very distinctive dark robber mask that goes from their snout through the eye, and then it fans out over the eardrum, which we call the tympanum. They also have this ridge down the side of their back. This is called a dorsolateral ridge, and that's because it separates the dorsum here from the lateral part of the body. So it's this big ridge, and that's going to help you tell it apart from a somewhat similar looking species called the chorus frog. So again, this is one of the 2 earliest breeding species in the region. This is the only frog that occurs north of the Arctic Circle. So it's our only Alaskan frog. And so they're fairly cold tolerant. They can actually have 65% of the water in their body freeze solid and survive. And they do that by loading their tissues with glucose that basically acts as a cryoprotectant so that ice crystals don't form within their cells. So it keeps their cells from desiccating and crystallizing, and they're able to actually overwinter on land, hunker down in little burrows that they kind of make by shimmying their body into the substrate, and they go under the leaf litter. So there may still be snow or ice present when the species is active, because they do have this cold tolerance, but no matter what they do, still need open water to lay the egg. So if a pond is completely frozen over, you're not going to have activity. But early in certainly mid-March, let's say, where we start getting these kind of swings in temperature, you can have skim ice form, and then it might melt during the day, and then they might be calling that night. So not when it's frozen solid. And if you're in a very shaded pond, which is the typical type of environment for a wood frog, is forested temporary wetlands, you do need the water to open up a little bit so that they actually have a place to lay the eggs. So the species is very rare in Northeast Illinois. So do please contact me or contact your county coordinator if you think you've heard them. And we do not get many digital vouchers, recordings, or photos for observations for this species, and we need them in order to validate a lot of the observations. Indiana is the stronghold for this species. So if you are a Northwest Indiana monitor, a lot of the Illinois folks will be very jealous of you because you're in Wood Frog Central. You're kind of in the core of their range. They really like the dune swale habitat and those shallow ephemeral wetlands that have formed in that ridge swale morphology that you get close to the edge of Lake Michigan. And typically, wood frogs prefer larger tracts of mesic forest in Illinois where they occur. They like clay soil dominated flatwoods ponds, these shallow depressional ponds that dry up seasonally. But we only have documentation of them from a few locations. And again, it's an explosive breeder. They're easy to miss, which is one reason why we do ask that you record it. In part, their call sounds a lot like the territorial chuck that northern leopard frogs make. It also sounds like part of the call of plains leopard frog, and I'll play some of those for you later. But their call is a 2-note kind of quacking sound. I think they sound like ducks from far away. They kind of go, wah, 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 wah. But I'll play the real thing so you don't have to rely on my impression of them. one thing to note with wood frogs, and I'll point this out for a few other species, is that it's a low frequency call. They're actually inflating the vocal pouch in the water. So you can hear it in the air, but that's one of the reasons it's harder for us to be able to detect. It sounds a little bit muffled. It's not nearly as audible as the chorus frog or the spring peeper. So we'll go ahead and play this guy's call, and you can see also how much their color varies. This one is a very dark brown where you can almost barely make out that mask. So it's described often as disorganized clatter. When you hear a full chorus of them, it kind of sounds like some kind of cartoon villain cackling in the woods. It's this like kind of sound, which is really fun once you realize, oh, hey, that's wood frogs. So that is certainly one to listen out for, look out for. And again, please try to get a digital voucher of a photo or recording to help us document their distribution better. The next species is the chorus frog, and depending where you are in the region, you might have the western chorus frog, Pseudacris triceriata, or you might have the boreal chorus frog, Pseudacris maculatum. We do have some hybridization of them here and there. The call is pretty indistinguishable, so for our purposes, we're just asking you to identify them as chorus frogs. It's really a genetic difference and a slight pattern difference. So triceriata means 3 lines, and that's referring to these 3 stripes that go down their back. And like the wood frog, they do have a dark band that goes through the eye and over the tympanum. And people do occasionally confuse these because they see that dark stripe and they think it's that flared mask of the wood frog. But this is a distinct species. It's much smaller, about half an inch smaller. So these get up to about 1.5 inches in length. And one thing you'll notice is that it has a smooth back. It does not have that dorsolateral ridge that the pond frogs have. So that's one of the ways that you'll tell it apart if you do see them. But typically, these guys are really hard to find. Again, we have some variation in color and in pattern. So the triceriata, the westerns, have these 3 distinct stripes, very bold. The boreals, maculata means spotted. It's more like a broken pattern on their back. And so you can see some breaks here. This one barely has any patterning. And sometimes we see these aberrant color patterns that are really the manifestation of inbreeding when populations are genetically isolated in some preserves that are kind of surrounded by roads over time. We tend to see some very strange coloration. So I'll show you some other examples of that as we go. So this is really one of the most common species in the region. They're reported from about 85% of our survey routes. And again, they have that prolonged breeding season. They're easy to detect. So you'll hear them, you may not see them, but the call is described as a long preep. I can't do it. It's not as easy as the chorus frog, but it sounds like somebody taking a comb and running their fingers over the teeth of a comb. And so if you were to draw it, or if you go to the Macaulay Library and look at the spectrogram, you'll see it's like an escalating trill. So it's kind of this upward series of increasing frequency notes. So we'll go ahead and play that. All right, so I'm sure most of you have heard that these guys are what we call canopy generalists. So they'll use open marshes, they'll use wooded ponds, they'll use roadside ditches. Their eggs can develop and hatch to tadpoles in 96 hours. So 4 days, and you get tadpoles, and they can breed for this very long window. So they're one that we get in a lot of suburban and urban areas along roadways and things like that. Our next species is a related species to the chorus frog. This is a spring peeper, Pseudacris crucifer. And so the crucifer refers to this X on the back of the frog. So they can be tan, brown, sometimes they can be goldish color. And they have these little sticky adhesive toe pads. Compared to the chorus frog, the toe pads are pretty big, but compared to the gray tree frog, they're small adhesive toe pads. These guys are more arboreal than the chorus frog. So both the chorus frog and the peeper call by inflating that vocal pouch up in the air. And so it's a much more audible call. And they're also about the same size, about 1.5 inches in length. They have this very faint, in this guy, but this dark bar that goes across the top of the head between the eyes. And you can see a few kind of color variants here. These all have fairly consistent patterns, but occasionally I do see some where the X on the back is broken, or they have multiple X's. And again, that's often manifestation of inbreeding. So sometimes they look really kind of coppery gold, like the guy in the corner, or this more kind of drab gray, but you still see that X, very distinctive. So they used to be more common. This is a species that, based on our data, we are seeing range contraction with. They're restricted to a few larger forested sites. Where they occur, they tend to be abundant, but we're losing them from some sites in part because of canopy closure. And there's actually some master's research done by Susan Lawrence at Northern Illinois University, where she used our Calling Frog Survey program data to identify which sites consistently had high calling index of spring peepers and which sites had similar habitats but didn't have peepers. And then she went and started creating habitat models to figure out what they were really looking for in oviposition sites, so where they were going to breed and lay their eggs. And so she was measuring pond depth and area and canopy cover and emergent vegetation and water chemistry. And some of the main factors that were affecting their use of the ponds had to do with how open the canopy was. So they like forest around the pond, but they do like a light gap above the pond, and that's because it allows in situ photosynthesis, so you get more emergent vegetation, and they lay their eggs like this guy in the bottom is doing. That's an underwater photo. She's actually laying eggs on submerged vegetation, and so they need that substrate there in order to breed. So their name is really descriptive. It's a shrill call, like it's saying peep or peeper. And as we play the call, if you listen toward the end of the recording, you're going to hear a territorial trill, and it's going to sound like the chorus frog that we just heard, the fingers on a comb, but it sounds like a chorus frog with a sore throat. That's how I remember it. It's raspy. It's like kind of fingers on a rusty comb or something like that. So we'll go ahead and play that. So this is index 3, continuous chorus. That's the territorial trill. And that's also a territorial call. Very angry peeper. So those are some of the examples of the different type of vocalization. So you're listening for the peep, peep, peeper. And one thing I want to mention is that if you're out, during your 5 minutes and you hear them, they usually kind of start slow and then they build, which is why we have you listen for 5 minutes. You want to record the greatest intensity index that you hear. So we're trying to get the peak measure of breathing intensity that's happening. So you might hear them calling it index 1 at first, but if they escalate to index 2 or escalate to index 3, that's what we want to record. The next species is the northern leopard frog, and that's Lithobates pipiens or Rana pipiens. And these guys are one of the ones I was talking about earlier in terms of species that's often not detected, even though they are fairly widespread. They can vary in color. The back can be tan or very vibrant, almost kind of iridescent green, but they have these very dark brown oval patterns on their back. And if you look at the tympanum, the eardrum, it's solid brown. There's no spot on it, and that's going to help us distinguish it from a similar species. So the spots are really oblong. They have a kind of a light margin to them, but they have this very dark brown coloration. And they have this very bold dorsolateral ridge that goes the entire length of the frog's body. That's also going to distinguish it from the plains leopard frog, which has a break in that ridge. And these guys can get up to about 4 inches in length. And when I refer to length, I'm referring to snout to the end of the body. So tip of the nose to the end of the frog's body, not with its legs extended as though it were jumping, but just when it's sitting. So I know I was mentioning some of these aberrations we see in color pattern, often from genetic isolation. These are some examples from one of my field sites that is completely bound by roads. And so we see that these patterns over time start to run together when you have decreased genetic diversity. And we see this in a variety of species. It's when you tend to see more like albinism or melanism in certain species when they're genetically isolated, like squirrels, for example. Sometimes we see that in pockets of squirrels in city parks. So with the northern leopard frog, they are still locally common in the region, but some populations have either declined or are experiencing really wide annual fluctuations in numbers. And so, for example, in the state of Washington, they used to be widespread, and now they are down to a single locality where northern leopard frogs occur, and they're trying to reintroduce them. Similar things have happened with like very sudden die-offs of northern leopard frogs in the Dakotas. So it's one we really do want to pay attention to. So make sure you listen to the call, practice the call, make sure you can distinguish it from the wood frog and the plains leopard frog and pickerel frog, which all have similar calls. So these will use a variety of habitat types. You can find them in woodlands and in wet meadows. They will use temporary ponds, but they're not temporary pond obligate. They will facultatively or opportunistically use a temporary pond, but they tend to breed in semi-permanent water, marshes. You can find them in prairies. And their call sounds at first like a snore and then like a chuckle. So it's a 2-part call. And so you want to listen for both of those parts because the snore is very hard to hear, but it's going to help you distinguish it from species with similar calls. So it's going to, some people say a snore. I also think it kind of sounds like you're opening like a creaky old door in a haunted house really slowly. That's kind of what I visualize when I hear the call. It's like this, and then this kind of sound, and the part, the chuckle, sounds a lot like the wood frog, but it's not 2-note. It's usually 3 or 4 chuckles. And we'll play the plains leopard frog later, which is a kind of triplet of chuck sounds, but no snore. So I know this is a lot of information, but we do have these described for you in the recordings for you as well. That's the snore. There's the chuckle. So this is another species that's inflating the vocal pouch underwater, which is why it's so muffled. So definitely play it over. And if you're recording calls so that you can listen to them at home, I know a lot of people who have sites closer to roads like to do that. And then they put their headphones on and they can actually adjust the audio settings when they're playing it back to filter out some background noise, or, you know, increase the bass so you can really hear that part of the call. The next species is the American toad, Anaxyrus americanus. These used to be in genus Bufo. They were changed to Anaxyrus in also 2004, splitting basically the old world toads from the new world toads. And this is one that isn't as highly debated as the switch to Lithobates. So this is our American toad, and this is one that we're largely familiar with. It's a very common species in urban and suburban environments because they can do well in parks and gardens and things like that. And if we look at their body, there's a couple of ways we're going to tell them apart from another toad, the Fowler's toad, which is less common. So toads have a lot of glands covering their body. All amphibians have both mucus glands and granular glands. The mucus glands keep the skin moist so that they don't desiccate, and it helps them respire. The granular glands are actually glands that produce toxins, and how toxic a species is depends on the different toxins they can produce, but also the density of those granular glands. And so in American toads, we see this large gland back behind the eye. This is called the parotoid gland, and it's absolutely covered in toxin glands, and it produces a kind of milky looking secretion. If an animal tries to eat it, it's distasteful and toxic to a lot of predators. And they have these smaller glands, and people call them warts, but they're just clusters of these granular glands on the skin. And this is one of the reasons they're a little bit more adaptable. They can move on land, in part because they have a little bit thicker skin, they're a little bit more terrestrial, and because they have a higher density of toxin glands, they're a little bit more resistant to a variety of predators that can eat other frogs. So one of the ways we tell them from the Fowler's toad is because they have this heavily spotted belly or chest. And so Fowler's toads, in contrast, have plain belly. I'm going to plug my headset in because my cat is scratching something behind me. Sorry about that. Can you all hear me? Okay.
Yep, you sound great.
Great, wonderful. So yeah, they have that spotted belly and chest. And another way we tell them apart is by these crests behind their eyes. And these are called cranial crests. And they form this kind of L-shaped pattern behind the eye. In the American toad, there's a little bit of space between this crest and where the parotoid gland starts. And in some individuals, it actually connects to the crest with a little spur. In Fowler's toads, that crest is much closer to the back of the eye and is not really in contact with that gland. So that's one of the ways we could distinguish them. Oh yeah, one thing I forgot here. So American toads, they have these dark patches with these warts. And so they tend to have 1 to 2, sometimes maybe 3 of these warts per dark patch. In Fowler's toads, they tend to have like 4 or 5 of the warts per patch of dark coloration, and that's another way we could tell them apart. So American toads are widespread, and they're probably one of the most adaptable frog species in the region, again, because they can do really well in gardens and city parks, things like that. And I think they actually have one of the prettiest calls in the region. It's a musical trill, but unlike the tree frog and unlike the chorus frog, it doesn't quite escalate. Like if you were to draw out musical notes to match it, it would stay one note. It's just a really kind of pretty long whistling whir. And at the end of this recording, you'll hear some gurgling, which is male territorial calls.
So that's their territorial call. So the next species is the pickerel frog, and this is one that's rare. So there are very few places that it occurs in the region, and this one is Lithobates palustris. And superficially, it looks like a leopard frog, but instead of having ovals with a light margin, they have these much more square, kind of blocky patterns on them. And if you look at them kind of from the top down, those blocky patterns are roughly parallel to each other. They do have dorsolateral ridge, and they have this patch of yellow to very bright gold color kind of on their side and on their thigh. And one of the ways we can tell them apart, in addition to the spot shape, is that the snout is much more blunt. It's like a softly rounded nose compared to the leopard frog, which has a much more pointier nose. And I have a side-by-side photo. They're also a little smaller, so they're usually less than 3 inches in length. So here is pickerel frog and northern leopard frog side by side. Again, they look really similar, but these are much more oval. These are much more square. This guy, the leopard frog, has a very kind of pointy aerodynamic looking snoot. And here we've got this very rounded nose of the pickerel frog. And if his leg were extended, you would see that there's a very kind of bright yellow gold color here, which the leopard frog does not have. So these are very rare. Within the Chicago region, they are likely extirpated. They have not been documented since the late 1940s. And that's because they historically use groundwater fed streams, cold water, and very cold groundwater fed ponds in wooded areas. And because of the degree of altered hydrology for shipping in the Chicago region and with agricultural drainage tile in the surrounding area, we've altered the hydrology to the degree that the habitat really just doesn't occur in many places. So one place in our network that does occasionally document calls is Nuchusa grasslands in Lee and Ogle County. And if you go further west toward Galena by Apple River Canyon, there are populations of them there. There's been less hydrologic alteration in that particular patch of the state. So there are still some headwaters, some spots in McHenry County where potentially they might show up, in Winnebago County where they might show up, but we haven't had any voucher like digital documentation or photographic documentation of them. And they do have a kind of similar snorri call that people might mix up with the leopard frog call. But if you think you've heard this frog or seen this frog, please contact us so that we can help document it. The call, again, is kind of a snore, but it has a kind of a rise. So it starts slow and then it goes like meow, like that. And if you remember those toys that make animal sounds, there's like a cow in a can kind of barnyard animal toys. It reminds me of the cow toy. They sound just kind of like belligerent cows to me. We'll go ahead and play that. That one has indigestion. So yeah, it still has that snore component, but it doesn't do the that the leopard frog does. It's just the meow part. So you're paying attention to the shape of that call. The next species is the plains leopard frog, Lithobates blairii. And yes, this is another leopard frog. So it's also going to have one of these underwater kind of subtle calls. But instead of having very kind of ovoid brown spots, they have more kind of circular green dots on their back. So they look a little bit more polka dotty. It's lighter in color. They also get up to about 4 inches in length. And one of the other ways we can distinguish them is because they have a white spot in the tympanum, white spot in the ear. And they have this interrupted or broken dorsolateral ridge. So right here, there tends to be a break. In some individuals, it just stops there completely and you don't see this second section of it. And in other individuals, it just tapers and becomes really weak. So we're looking for that break. We're looking for the green circles rather than the dark brown ovals. And we're looking for that white spot. Now, these leopard frogs tend to use sandy habitats. Sand prairies is typically where we find them. So places like Medewan National Tallgrass Prairie, Goose Lake Prairie, so potentially Will County, Grundy County, these are places where we might get this species. You're not going to find this species in Lake McHenry and Winnebago County. They just don't range that far north. So that's one less species that you necessarily need to know for your survey if you're in a northern county, but it's good to learn it, especially if you make a visit to one of these other sites during breeding season so you can pick out the call and impress your friends. If it's safe to gather with friends, that is. So we've got our plains leopard frog and our northern leopard frog side by side. So here's our plains leopard frog with that light spot in the tympanum. The northern leopard frog has a brown tympanum, no white on it. He's got that bold dorsolateral ridge, and here the plains leopard frog has that weak ridge with the break, and again, circular spots with more green versus the dark brown ovals. Again, these are rare. They do get into Grundy County, but Will County is really a good spot for them. So again, if you think you've heard this, try to record it, let us know. The call sounds, again, like a chuckle. It doesn't have that snore component that the other guys do. And it has this kind of triplet cadence where it's going chuck, 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 chuck. So when I play this recording, you're going to hear something that sounds like crickets or marbles being clicked together first. That's going to be a cricket frog call. And then you're going to hear something that sounds like a bird. And that's actually an eastern gray tree frog. And then you'll hear the chuck, chuck, chuck of the plains leopard frog. So I'll try to raise my hand like that when the plains leopard comes on. So those are cricket frogs. Here we go. And that's a little territorial scuffle. So what you were hearing that sounds like a bird is an eastern gray tree frog. We're listening for that chirp, 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 chirp. And again, there's no drawn out snore ahead of it. So the next two species are the gray tree frogs, which again are morphologically identical but have unique calls. So we have Cope's gray tree frog, which is Hyla chrysosceles, and eastern gray tree frog, Hyla versicolor. They can both change color to kind of match their background a bit, not like huge drastic color changes, but usually to blend in with moss or vegetation or the bark of trees, occasionally with the color of buildings as well. So here is our gray tree frog. They get up to about 2 inches in length, and they have really pretty coloration. So again, in those old previous photos, they could be very gray. This one has more green coloration. Usually with some blotches on the back to mimic lichens. and they have this light pale green spot below the eye. So in juveniles, they tend to be more solid green, but you still see that light patch, and that's going to tell you this is a gray tree frog. Along with that, they have big sticky toe pads. So these guys are very highly arboreal, and they'll often hang out under lights in parking lots or people's garages or on trees. But if there's a light nearby, they actually take advantage of that to feed on nocturnal insects that might be drawn to the light. So it acts as an ecological trap for the insects, and then the frogs are feeding on them in that way. They also have this very bright yellow gold coloration kind of at the top of their thigh where it meets their body. And they're generally uncommon in the region, but where they do occur, there are some very large populations, but they like more wooded areas. So if you're monitoring in completely open prairie with no woodland, you're not going to pick these guys up. And just because of some of the level of fragmentation, some of the woodlands that we have in northeastern Illinois that may have historically have them tend not to support them. But in the northeastern part of the state, from the Des Plaines River and the Lake Michigan drainage, that's where we tend to find eastern gray tree frogs. And I think if you get into Indiana, you can get both as well. So it's going to depend on your location. But both of them chorus in round 2 in midsummer. And the eastern gray tree frog has this very kind of flute-like, bird-like trill. So as it gets warmer, they call at a faster rate, like that. It starts to sound like a little bit like a woodpecker. In contrast, Cope's gray tree frog in northeastern Illinois is known from the Fox River drainage and the Kishwaukee River drainage. So further west, we get Cope's. So again, similar habitat requirements. They like this dense forest in larger tracts, and you will find them in a lot of sites along the Fox River, certainly. The call is a faster, harsher call. It sounds a bit like a cicada to me. I think it's a little bit of a metallic buzzing insect-like call. And we're getting into the late breeding species, and I do realize I'm running long, so I do apologize, but try to stick with us if you can. So our next species is the green frog, Lithobates or Rana climatans, and this is one of the species that's probably increased in abundance in the region. So these can be green to brown in color, and they have also a weak ridge down their back, weak dorsolateral ridge. So this is one of the ways we tell them apart from the bullfrog. So they have this ridge that goes from the eye around the tympanum, and then it extends about 1/3 of the way down the back, basically like to mid-back on them, and then it stops. In the bullfrogs, they don't have that extended piece right here. They just have the ridge along the tympanum. So the males, and this is the case for green frogs and for bullfrogs, the diameter of the tympanum of the males is larger than the diameter of the eye. So this would be a male. If it was the same size as the eye or slightly smaller, then it's going to be a female. And we'll show you a female bullfrog later so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. So again, still fairly common in the region because these will actually breed in both semi-permanent and permanent bodies of water. And the tadpoles can take a year to complete metamorphosis. So they'll actually spend the winter in the pond. And if you go up to the edge of a pond early in the season and you see these really big tadpoles, those are likely green frog or bullfrog tadpoles that have overwintered. And in the case of bullfrogs, they can do that a couple of times, sometimes 2 to 3 years to get as large as possible before they complete metamorphosis to go onto land. And so they use permanent bodies of water because then they have the time to grow without worrying about the pond drying as much. So they like these really heavily vegetated types of ponds with lots of duckweed, lots of emergent vegetation. And the call will be familiar to you, I'm sure. It sounds like someone plucking a loose banjo string or a series of gulp, gulp kind of sounds, very cartoon frog sounding. And that's their territorial little grunt. So they do an alarm call or a warning call when you walk up on them or when a predator disturbs them. And a lot of people think that it's a completely different species, that it's like a tiny little frog because it's a really funny little squeak. But this is the same frog. So I'll play that. It's the kind of sound you might expect from the chorus frog or the spring peeper, someone who's maybe like 1.5 inches long, but no, it's the bullfrog, or sorry, not the bullfrog, the green frog jumping off of a log to get away from predators. So the next frog that we have is the cricket frog, Acris crepitans, and this is the smallest frog that we have in the region, and they can be really variable in color. They're about 1 inch in length, sometimes smaller, and they have somewhat warty skin, but they don't have those big parotoid glands behind the eye or those crests like the toads. So that's one way you can distinguish it from a toad. The color can be really variable. So you see this one has this really brilliant kind of moss green stripe and patch on its nose, and then it has some copper and some brown. They all have these very bold, broad stripes on the hind limbs, and yeah, somewhat warty skin. And they all have this kind of triangular patch of color between the eyes. It's usually dark brown. So sometimes the frog is mostly tan, and then you'll still see kind of a dark brown triangle on the back of its head. So again, highly variable. Here are a few other photos so you could see what they often look like, little bits of green, sometimes a little bit of rust, but they blend in very well with kind of muddy river banks or sandy edges of different streams. And so these are semi-aquatic. They always stay pretty close to the water, and they tend to live along the banks of large permanent bodies of water with like shallow slopey banks. So large ponds and small streams. If you go to Starved Rock State Park in Illinois, certainly in August, you'll see them jumping all over in the streams. If you walk down in the canyons at Starved Rock or Matheson State Park, they're pretty abundant there. And again, this is the one that was once our most common amphibian in the state, but they really dropped out of that northern third of Illinois. And part of the reason for that is because they only live a little over a year. They reach maturity and breed within the year, and they don't tend to live much longer than that. And so if their breeding site dries up, and they don't have a way to get to another body of water in a drought year if they can't move from like a semi-permanent to a permanent body of water, or get to another river because of all the roads or dams blocking them, they end up getting kind of knocked out of that assemblage. And so we lose them from certain areas. And so we have this kind of wavering boundary of where they occur in the state. And so they're in southern King County, southern DeKalb County, they're in Will County. Some years we detect them in southern DuPage County, but not every year. And usually it's only a few. And so, you know, over time, maybe they will continue to advance north, but we still have a lot of impediments to their movement. So they are a late breeding species. And we heard their call earlier with the plains leopard frog. I'll play it again. It's this series of kind of clicks or ticking sounds that start to sound like crickets. And it's going to speed up in the middle and then slow down at the end. There's a bullfrog in the background. So this is an index 3. So you can't tell individuals anymore. So the next species is the Fowler's toad. And for those of you from Northwest Indiana, you are possibly going to have these in your area. They are very, very rare in Northern Illinois, but in Northwest Indiana, we do have some sites that still support this species. So we do hope that you're able to pick them up on your surveys. So they're very tan in color with kind of these distinct bars or spots, and they have typically more than 3 warts per spot. They will have a few like here that have 2, but usually you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in that case. And again, you see that large parotoid gland, but the crest on the back of the head is actually right up against the eye rather than very kind of visible and prominent further back. They're about the same size as an American toad, but they have a white or nearly white belly. So they might have a couple of little freckles and spots like this, like this guy right here. But compared to the American toad, it's a much more plain belly. And these are rare in the region because they're restricted to sandy areas around Lake Michigan. So a lot of that sand was mined in the early 1900s in Illinois, and other areas that had a lot of dunes were developed, and certainly there was also a lot of sand extraction and mining in parts of Indiana, but they do still occur at Indiana dunes, and historically they would have been in Lake and Cook County, Illinois, along Lake Michigan, but we have lost a lot of their breeding habitat. And so their call is really distinctive. It sounds like a sheep caught in a trap. And I know that's a weird description, but once you hear it, you'll probably agree. There we go. So it's not a species that you're likely to really mix up with anything else, maybe the pickerel frog, but they use very different habitat types. So again, these guys are in these sandy historic dune areas. Potentially you could get them at Braidwood Dunes in Will County. That distribution is a little fuzzy in terms of recent records or historical documentation of them, but historically they would have been all along, like through the Calumet region, all along the lake shore into Wisconsin. So here is kind of a close-up of those warts per spot side by side. So you see this one on the right with the Fowler's toad has like 4 or 5 warts, a couple here, there's 4 in this patch here, versus in the American toad where we get the 2, 1. And here you really see the cranial crests with the space, and then there's a little spur on this one connecting it to the parotoid gland. And here in the Fowler's toad, we really can't see those crests present at all because they're actually right up against the back of the eye. And if we look at their bellies, here they are side by side, and you can really see how much more heavily spotted the belly of the American toad is versus the Fowler's toad. So sometimes, the warts per spot can vary, and if there's hybridization at a place where they come into contact, you may see some questionable individuals. So we actually look for these combinations of features, but if you can record the call, that's really going to tell us what species it is. So the next frog, this is our last frog, is the bullfrog, Rana catesbiana or Lithobates catesbiana. So this is one I'm sure we've all heard and seen in the region. And so these are very large frogs. And as I was mentioning, to tell them apart from the bullfrog, or sorry, from the green frog has the ridge that extends around the tympanum, and then it goes about 1/3 of the way down the back and stops. The bullfrog, the ridge just goes around the tympanum. And in this case, this is a female bullfrog. That eardrum, that tympanum, is smaller, lost my mouse, okay, smaller in diameter than the eye of the frog, or about the same size, versus that really big tympanum that we saw in the green frog in the other photo. And so these can get up to 8 inches in length. So that's the size of a small kitten, if you think about that. And here they are side by side. So the bullfrog is over here on the left. So again, you see that ridge just around the eardrum. And here's the green frog with the ridge extending partway. And then it just basically stops. It also has the eardrum ridge, but it has that nice clear extension. So bullfrogs are very common in permanent water bodies in the Chicago region, and again, likely that they increased in abundance because they can take advantage of a lot of farm ponds. They can take advantage of golf course ponds and other man-made lakes and other water bodies like detention basins that we have in cities. So this is one that you are likely to see in a city park, green frogs and bullfrogs. Of frogs, these are pretty good dispersers because of those big, powerful hind limbs. So they can cross roads a little bit more readily than the other species, and they're just bigger, so they can move further. So they chorus during the hottest part of the season in late May through early July, and it's this low vroom, vroom call. So we'll play that. Oops. So one of their alarm sounds that they will make if they're startled, it kind of sounds like someone hitting a drum and then a big splash. So we'll play that for you. Cricket frogs. That. There we go. Usually you hear the big splash. It's usually going to be a bullfrog. just to show you a little bit more about those color variants I was mentioning, we do have blue bullfrogs in the region. This is a color mutation that does occur. It's not restricted to Chicagoland and Chicago wilderness area. This does occur in like upstate New York. I've seen one when I was in college up there, and you can really pick them out because here's one in duckweed, and it really looks like it's almost plastic or something. You don't think it's a real frog at first. It's so very kind of vibrant turquoise. And here's one in hand in the middle. So sometimes it's the entire body, but this big girl, she is full of eggs. That's why she looks kind of like, oops, Jabba the Hutt. And we see that blue coloration, but here it's only on kind of the front of the body. And so I've seen some photos people have sent me of some actually from Kankakee, Illinois, and they had maybe like half the frog looked blue. And I'm not sure why it's not like a full body phenotype that they get, but we do see these types of aberrations, and I think it's pretty neat. So if you do see a blue frog, try to take a picture, let me know about it. It would be cool to see if this is localized to certain parts of the region, because I'll tell you that most of the ones that I have seen living here have been in DuPage County. So that's pretty neat. So just to practice assigning a call index, I'll play a couple of examples so you get, again, that clear picture of what the index is like. So again, index 1 means we have no overlap. There's space between the calls. So this is pickerel frog at index 1. So that's our cow, right? And I'll play our eastern gray tree frog at index 2. So there's some overlap, but you can distinguish individual. And there's an American toad. And there is a green frog in the background too. There he is. And spring peepers at index 2. So again, overlap, but you can still distinguish them a bit. And cricket frogs at index 3. So constant continuous chorus. You can't tell where one call is stopping and one is ending. So on our website, we do have these call recordings, and we have some that have multiple species. So it's very useful to try to practice those and pick those out. Before we go, I'll just show you where to access the data form and just kind of walk you through this quickly. And if you have questions about this, there is a written set of instructions on our website, and you can always email me, and I actually have this presentation section of data entry as a PDF available. So we are trying to upgrade our database to Pollard base, which is a national database that accepts community science data for a variety of programs. So we're waiting on some grants to do that. So right now we're using this Google form. If you've used it last year, this is just really review. We've just changed a couple of things. And this version, again, of instructions is available on our website. So if you have questions, if you want to receive a copy of data that you submitted in the past, or you want to see what species might have been found. If your site was monitored in the past, you can send me an email, because at present that is not just visible by going to the website. We have to pull that for you. So if you go to our website, frogsurvey.org, we've got this data entry and output menu tab. You're going to click on that, and that will bring you to the data entry page. You click where it says enter data here, and that's going to open up the data form. The entry and output instructions are just below it. So if you need to review any of these slides, it is right there for you. So this is what the data entry form looks like. It's basically the same information that's on the data sheet. You're just adding in some drop-down menus and filling in your form online. So you'll put, your email and try to use a consistent route name so that we don't get confused. If people have similar route names and you kind of change it time to time, we want to try to keep track of who is doing which route. So please try to be consistent. And if you are monitoring with a partner, I only need one of you to enter the data. So have a designated data entry person so that we don't get duplicate sets from multiple people from the same sampling outing. So we'll ask you to complete a separate form for each survey that you conduct. So don't try to collapse it all into one. So if you monitor 5 times during the season, you'll fill out this form 5 times. So each data set has to be associated with the unique date that you conducted your survey on. So you just type in your email and your route name and whatever your route description was from your data sheet. So the types of habitats, whether it's temporary pond or a marsh or a lake. Please make sure you pick what state you are in, because as many of you know, we have Lake County in both Illinois and Indiana, and there's some different species there. So it's useful if you can help us out with that, and your county, your monitor name, or that's your name, and if you have a partner, you can include them there. You type in the date, select your sampling round, and then we have those precipitation and below freezing checkboxes that were on the data sheet, just as little yes, no drop-down menus. You'll enter your start time and your end time. Please make sure it's set to PM. And for Sky Code, this is all the information that you already wrote down in your data sheet. You're just transferring it into here. So you'll have your locations listed in a column and the different options for what the Sky Code was kind of going across. And there's a scroll bar if you can't see all of them. So if it was the same the whole time, you could just check it once and say, oh, Sky Code 0 the entire time. If it changed, you can indicate that it changed and at what location, just like you did on your data sheet. And it's the same thing with cloud cover. So again, we have space for up to 8 locations, but if you only had, for example, 5 locations, your data sheet would look like this. So you have your locations listed here, 1 through 5. You've got your cloud cover if it was changing a lot. And here's the scroll bar at the bottom if you need to see all of the values. The values are at the top, so 0 to 10% to up to 100%. So you may just need to kind of move it to the right to see all the values. So same thing for wind code. You're going to put that wind speed code in. So we have, again, our locations and the different wind codes. And again, if it was the same, you could just leave it. If there's extra locations that you don't have on your route, you only have 3 locations, you would leave 5 of them, the next 5 blank. So you type in your starting and ending air temperature if it differed. And then you're going to get a question about whether you've entered location coordinates for your route this season. So if you've never monitored before, or if you've changed your points, please check, no, I haven't. We'll ask you to enter them once, but then the next time you fill out the form, you won't have to do it again. You could just say, yes, I've entered them for the season. You don't have to type in all those coordinates each time. If one of your points changes, if a big tree comes down and you can't get to that point, or if every time you go out there it's flooded and you need to kind of readjust where your point is, you can talk to me about that, but please check that one of the monitoring locations has changed and put in the new set of coordinates. So this is what the coordinate section looks like. You'll put in your location for your listening point. So location 1, you could name it something like Lone Oak Pond, or you could just call it location 1 at whatever site. And you have your location description. So it's a temporary shallow pond. It's next to a large oak tree, or it's shaded, or it's open. And then you enter your latitude and your longitude. Again, longitude is going to be negative number. A lot of times people will type in like an N or a W for north or west. You don't need to do that. I just end up having to pull out those characters out of the data sheet later. So if you just type in the numbers and the negative for the longitude, that just makes it a little easier for me later on, which would be much appreciated. And again, as long as you're keeping those coordinates the same throughout the season, you only need to put that in that one time. Hit next. When you finish that, if you need to change anything, you can hit back to make any corrections, and then it will bring you to the frog call section. So it looks just basically transposed from how the data sheet looks. So we've got a table for each species, and we have the locations again listed in that first column, and then the options for not heard, index 1, index 2, or index 3 going across the columns. So if I didn't hear a wood frog at any of my locations, I would check that off. If I heard index 1 at location 1, I'd check here. Index 2 at location 2, I'd check there. So you'll scroll down and each of the species will have its own table where you fill this out for each location. So as an example, in this data set, bullfrogs were not heard at location 1, 2, or 3, but they were heard at index 1 at location 4 and index 2 at location 5. And again, we only had 5 listening points, so those extras are blank. So you can hit next. If you have notes about water levels, cool things you saw, if you saw a frog and you're not sure, you want to let me know about something, or other conditions have changed, weather, wind speed, things like that have changed that might affect what you're hearing when you're sampling. If there was a lot of road noise, for example, or low-flying planes, whatever, you can make those notes here as well. There's a space for general route comments and notes. Some of our monitors are also collecting light pollution data. If this is something that you're interested in doing for your route, I can let you know about a phone app called Loss of the Night, which we're working on in partnership with Adler Planetarium to try to get light pollution data for our different frog sampling locations. And it's not something you would need to do every time. If that is something you're interested in, I can certainly give you more information about that. So you can let me know in your email that it's something you'd like to try out. So you could type in your light pollution magnitude data there if you are collecting that. And make sure you hit submit so that the data actually goes into our online form. And you should get this confirmation screen at the end. So if you don't get the confirmation screen, it didn't go through, but this should be what comes up. And it can prompt you if you want to fill out the next form, if you want to enter all your data at once, you just hit submit another response and it'll bring you back to the beginning. If you have any questions about that, please email me at this address. And this is on our website as well, and it's in the copy of our protocol and in the online data entry instructions as well. Some additional resources. This is what that phenology project I was talking about earlier looks like when you go to the website. So you could click on any species. So here I've clicked on American toads, and it's showing me observations by county. So basically everything that's shaded green is a county where an American toad was reported, and the darker the green, the more recent the observation. So right now things aren't active. So this map on the left is showing, I lost my mouse, map on the left is showing over years, but this map on the right is showing in weeks. So when you're frog monitoring, if you want to see if a species is calling near you or just observed near you, you could go and look at this page, look at the map and see, is my county green? Are any of the counties near me green? And that will be a useful tool, and you can enter your own observations there as well. So the link to that is this phenology.mwpark.org, and this is on our website as well. So really, as long as you have our website, you should be able to find data sheets, call recordings, photos, species descriptions, videos, written instructions for our survey and our data entry, boot disinfection protocol, the links to these apps or various pages. We have a Calling Frog Survey Facebook group if you're interested in staying in touch with other monitors and finding out what other people are hearing. And this is the Loss of the Night app. This is what that looks like, which is a free app on both Android and iPhone to collect light pollution data. And you do that, you actually track stars and say whether or not different stars are visible. It's a lot of fun. And that's actually part of a global community science light pollution project that was started in Europe. And here we are feeding it data. So it's really useful. A couple of other community science opportunities. I know auditory memory is really tricky if you've never done it before. The nice thing about this program is that we just have 13 species and they are broken up by season and by habitat type. But if you are a visual learner or you want to engage in one of the other community science programs in the region at the museum, we are home to Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network, which I think is in its 32nd year. So if you're a visual learner and you like butterflies, it's many more species, but you're out during the day and sampling. And we also have the Illinois Odonate Survey at the Nature Museum, which is our dragonflies and damselflies. So you can have overlap between some of these routes in terms of going near water and seeing not just the frogs at night, but seeing what they're eating. And the dragonfly larvae also feed on tadpoles. So you see these different kind of components of the same ecosystem. And I think that's pretty neat. Also, if you get hooked on audio surveys at night, there is a singing insect survey, and I put the website here, and this is to monitor different calling insects like katydids and crickets and cicadas, a lot of night calling species, although cicadas also call during the day. Again, we have this slide on our website under Monitor Resources. There's a Contact Us page, and all of these emails for the various regions are there. So if you have time to stick around, I will do a call quiz, which you can answer via poll. I'll try to get to your questions, but if you can't stick around, I will go through the chat tomorrow and try to get back to anyone. I realize I'm going long, so I apologize about that. So we'll go ahead and launch this poll. So you're gonna select the frog species that you hear calling in the recording. And there's more than one right answer. So I'll share those results. So the main species that we heard kind of in the forefront was the American toad. It's that long whistling whir trill that stays kind of at one note the whole time. And there were spring peepers in the background. So those were the two species that were in that particular recording. Don't be discouraged if those are not the ones you picked. Chorus frog and spring peeper can be very similar. And I know the tree frog and the toad can certainly sound similar, but we're listening for that single note versus that escalating trill. So those are the types of things that, especially if you look at that Macaulay library link, which is on our website, if you look at the shape of the calls, I think that really helped me having both the audio and that visual cue is really a useful way to learn that. So we'll do the second one. Oops. So again, select which species you hear. Oops. Oh, I hit launch polling. Sorry about that. There's too many buttons. Okay. I'll play that one again. Oh, I showed the answer. All right, so that one was a little bit tricky. There's definitely Fowler's toad calling. That's that. Wah. There were some Cope's gray tree frogs intermittently in the background, and if you listen to it again, and we do have these recordings on our website, you can hear those. And then the cricket frog was the clicking that we heard. So I see a few people picked pickerel frog. So pickerel is the one that sounds like the angry cow, that it's more like a meow rather than a wah. I know they're similar kind of loud brash sounds, but you're also listening for that inflection of if it's arcing, if it's staying in this kind of one intense call. So third one, again, select the species that you hear. I'll play it again. Oh, sorry, I keep showing the answer. So there was a northern leopard frog calling at the beginning, and so we heard that snore followed by the chuckle, that combination, the snore and the chuckle, is the northern leopard frog. So if you didn't hear the snore and you only heard the chuckle part, you might think that it was a wood frog or a plains leopard frog, potentially a pickerel frog. And then in the background, there were spring peepers calling as well. So it's just the beep, 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 and not the trill. So again, you learn this by repetition. That's really the best way to do it. And the last quiz is both call ID and assigning a call index. So that's a little bit trickier. And you might want to scroll down if you can't see a couple of options. Okay, so we definitely had spring peeper, and that was index 3. So it was that continuous chorus that sounds like sleigh bells, where you can't really distinguish individuals anymore. And the tree frogs were tricky. It was a Cope's gray tree frog with that more metallic, um, faster trill. I know it can sound like a fast eastern gray tree frog, but you just have to listen to both of the recordings to get a little more practice discerning those. But again, if you know it's a gray tree frog based on your location, if you're along the Fox River or closer to the Des Plaines River, for example, we would be able to help you discern which one it is as well. And that was in index 2. So there was a lot of calling, but you could still hear where one call was ending and one was stopping. You could still make out that there were countable, if distinguishable individuals. It wasn't this constant overlap where you've totally lost track. And again, you don't have to try to count them, but if you can kind of say, can I even hear the beginning and end of distinct calls in all of that noise? That's one of the ways that you would distinguish between an index 2 and an index 3. Um, so I am happy to answer some questions if anyone has, but otherwise, if you don't, have a wonderful night, and certainly contact me if you think you want to monitor. Please send me an email with a short list and fill out an application on our website. And also you can send a note to your county coordinator, or I can help put you in touch with the right person. Like if you're in Chicago and you're not sure if you want to do a Chicago park or a forest preserve, I can help you figure out who to talk to there. Or if you're out of state, for example, I can put you in touch with the right people. So I see we have a question about water temperature. Water temperature can affect activity levels of calls as well, but the air temperature is probably the easiest thing that we can all readily measure. So I know in some years and some agencies do have thermometers that you can use to measure water, but we don't have enough basically to do that widespread. So we're doing we're doing air temperature because that's actually the easiest metric to know if we're not sure if there's going to be activity, since we're not like all able to go out to the site and measure water temperature, from home. Clearly, you can look at your phone and say, well, if it's 45 degrees air temperature, that should be warm enough for them to be calling in the water, especially if it's been that warm all day. Species that may be found in a fen or a bog. Yes. Oh, you're all welcome. Thank you. Pickerel frogs are fen associated species. So that was, one of these species that had a lot of the hydrologic alteration. So we lost a lot of habitat for it. There are some fens I know in pockets of Kane County and McHenry County and Cook County that may still have some hydrology. I think with the pickerel frogs, it's kind of been the extent of hydrologic alteration that's really done them in. So we have these pockets preserved, but if the larger kind of landscape level hydrology has been really heavily altered, then we end up kind of losing that regional distribution. If they're narrowed down to one site, the likelihood of persisting for the long term becomes slimmer and slimmer. Do we have any other questions? There's a question about, have Fowler's toads been found in northern Illinois? So it's a good question. There are some older records from pockets of Will County. Historically, they would have been in Lake County. There have not been any recent records of them. I have found some really suspicious looking Fowler's toads in Lake County that, or excuse me, American toads, I should say, that have spots that look like a Fowler's toad on the back with like 5 and 6 warts per spot, and the cranial crest looking like a Fowler's toad, but then they have a really heavily spotted belly, and they're doing the American toad call. So the call is really what's distinguishing selection by females as to which species it is. Now, it doesn't mean that they couldn't have hybridized over time, and as they become isolated, you end up getting, pockets with these aberrations where they might look more like one species or have kind of mixed characteristics, and that really is the result of fragmentation. But historically, they would have been found, all along the lakeshore where we had sand dune habitat. They like those inland dune swale pools. So unfortunately, it's a habitat loss thing. So that's why Indiana dunes is kind of the stronghold for them. That was a pocket that was protected from a lot of the sand mining that went on in the regional history. Trying to see if there's any other. Oh, okay. Yeah, okay, boreal and western chorus frogs. So western chorus frogs will have 3 distinct stripes down the back. The boreals, instead of the stripes, their pattern is more broken up into like shortened bars or almost spots on the back. So maculatum, boreal, genus and species is Pseudacris maculatum, and maculatum means spotted versus the triseriatum means 3 lines. So if you see one with 3 bold lines, morphologically, that would group with the western chorus frogs. However, it really is more of a genetic difference. And in the region, we can have both in different places, but I-80, where it kind of goes through northern Illinois, is somewhat of a dividing line, not an absolute, but it's a good reference point. So if you're north of I-80, chances are you are in boreal chorus frog country, and if you're south of I-80, you might still be in boreal, but you're getting closer into western chorus frog territory. So there was a kind of genetic study of all the chorus frogs in the state done probably about 8 years ago by Chris Phillips at Illinois Natural History Survey. And so he has some maps that he's done of all the different chorus frogs, and it's kind of a wavery boundary, but right around I-80 for our reference is generally a good dividing line. And for our purposes, saying chorus frog is suitable. Okay. I don't know if there are any other questions I didn't get to. So if you still have a question, I'll stay on a little bit longer, and you can unmute and let me know. Otherwise, have a lovely evening, and I hope to hear from you all.
Thanks so much, Allison. I really appreciate this, and I'm excited for our monitors to get going.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right.
Oh, Barbara, have a great night, but thank you.
Thanks.
Those presentations were wonderful.
Thanks so much. And I can share the recording if anyone needs, if you know of monitors who weren't able to make it. I'm happy to share that.
Okay, sounds great. I noticed I had, I think, 2 people on tonight and a couple from previous. So
Awesome.
all right, thank you.
Have a good night. All right, everyone. You can email me if you have any further questions that you come up with, and I'll let you all go. So, oh, was that one more question? Oh, you're very welcome. Great to see you back. And everyone have a lovely evening.